So, the first one to definitely think about is storage. And as Andretta mentioned, you have the original files, which are usually like the big, pristine, perhaps it's a TIFF file as like the original file. And then there's the work files, the worker bees, where it's like maybe it needs to then be a JPEG so I can go to Costco and print it, or maybe it has to be a JPEG because that's a lesser file size to then put in my collections management system. So thinking about file size, file storage, and the complications that may arise depending on your situation. Thinking about multi-location storage, this is getting into some digital preservation best practices, which there's a link on this slide to reference for much more information about that. But thinking about multiple locations, whether that is on your computer and then on somebody else's computer across the United States, or whether that is on your computer but also in the cloud, which then also backs up across the United States, making sure you have at least more than just your computer for storing these files, because I can't tell you how many hearts have been broken and tears have been shed because projects were being done and saved just on one computer, and then that computer dies and they are irretrievable. So please don't be a broken heart story. And which goes nicely into my backups bullet point and revisioning. It's important to make sure that, especially if you're in a very active digitization phase, that you're backing up daily, and depending on how many scans, maybe even hourly, in terms of making sure it's not just on your computer, but also maybe backing up to the cloud or an external hard drive, something. Just please be careful about that. And then also keeping in mind revisioning or file versioning is another way to think about it. And this is another digital preservation piece to keep in mind is when we create files, they every time we open them, they are changed. Whether we purposefully change them or not, there's a little bit of an access cost. And so thinking about having that original pristine file that is untouchable, and then also creating that supplemental worker bee access copy is a very good practice to have, especially if digital preservation is important for your particular organization. And then, of course, security to access data on these files or with these files, who has access, what are the points of access, is there security that you need to worry about or not? And that's usually a larger conversation with whatever your larger parent organization is.
One thing that I would like to add actually about the revisioning is if you are planning on doing any photo or video manipulation,
Mm.
make sure that you have that original, because once you revise it and change the color or cut pieces out of a video, you can't get that back.
Yep. Thank you for mentioning. And that has definitely happened to younger Rachel,
Yeah,
naive past Rachel. Yes.
same thing. So,
Okay. I'm pretty sure we have like a club or something.
yeah.
All right. Thinking about access points, which is something that Andretta and I have both alluded to now, and that is you go through this great digitization process. If your part of your intended goal was to do that, to provide access to these images or movies or files or what have you, how are you doing that? Usually it is through a collections management system or CMS. And originally, even just a few years ago, there was a big difference between a CMS and a DAMS or a digital asset management system. With the two, and as I've outlined on the slides, the collection management system primarily used to be about collecting the item information about the collection, mostly text based until we could finally start adding digital surrogates of these items. And the digital asset management system traditionally was all about just storing those digital files, maybe doing some digital file preservation, and it was just about storage, not really about access. Now we're getting a bit of a crossover across these products in terms of maybe you have a collections management system, but now you're able to do text with image. Now you're able to do a collections management system that publishes online instead of just the internal card catalog. And for digital asset management systems, they are starting to offer public access or delivery mechanisms for things that are stored in the dams. And some examples of this come from Silicon Valley, Google Drive, Dropbox, products that are able to function primarily as just asset storage. You can also now share, collaborate, publish online, that type of thing. So my point of bringing this up is to highlight some of the differences, but to also highlight that at this point, depending on what your needs are, you may only need one because it does most of what you need. And I definitely have a different webinar on that that you can check out later. But for our purposes now, you've got options. And so we definitely wanted to address that nothing is permanent and thinking about why is it that we digitize. And what I want to share with this one is all of the things that have been created for the most part is organic. So paper is an organic material, photos and negatives, the emulsion process, etc. All of those items, because they are of organic material, they are going to deteriorate at some point. And similarly, even though we are digitizing things, digital is not forever. And so we're not sure how long digital is going to be. But files can get corrupted, lost. I mean, see previous slide on storage. And so we really need to think about what does permanent really mean and how can we protect both physical and digital in its permanency. And related to this, of course, is disaster events, whether that is man made disasters or natural disasters, which can damage our items that are both physical and digital. So, trying to do the best we can in anticipating damage events and trying to put solutions and strategies in place when those do happen.
And then another thing is when you digitize, you have to look at what you're digitizing. So if you do it and then you have a death in the family, they were alive to help you determine who was in the photos. But if you wait and say, oh, I can do it later, or not just family and friends, but also important community members, if you wait, their stories can't be told in the same way. And improved for Schellinger research, especially improved accessibility. And I know that Rachel Christine Consulting is also about improved accessibility. You know, making sure that people from across the US or across the world who might not have the funds or ability to travel to see documents, they now can. And preserving history with the records being destroyed either because of disaster or just over time, that history is gone and it's impossible to get back. And so by digitizing, you are saying, I find history important and I find this person's story or this town's story or organization story important enough to save it.
Mhm. And I think this is an excellent sort of case in point for us who are working in the field. We know how important these items are and how important digitization is for preserving them and providing access. And so for the many times that we hear from people who don't know better, the okay, well, if you digitize it, you can just throw it away, right? Like after you're done, like we need the space. And that like, oh, please don't. And so if you encounter that, use this slide and explain nothing is permanent, including digital, and nothing should be thrown away. Maybe in extreme circumstances, like I guess I can't say never, but that is why it is important to keep the original physical item
Yes,
and have a digital.
completely agree. Never get rid of anything, even if you put it in a back room because you don't want people to touch it, which further degrades the records, and you have them digital, still have those as a backup because that's still history.
Mhm.
And if something happens to your digital file, you still have those.
Yes. All right, the next one, hearing from people, well, why can't you just digitize it all? So we did want to acknowledge that it is an impossible Sisyphean task if we were to digitize it all. And also, like, you shouldn't. There are cases where you shouldn't digitize. And so, what I would love for you to keep in mind when you come up against this is to think about just like the time and the funding constraints that exist for you and how that those alone render it practically impossible to digitize all of your collections. And I know Andretta has a couple points to share with you there too.
So, one thing to look at is current accessibility versus envisioned. So, if you have everything accessible to everyone right now in physical form, but certain things are never checked out or never looked at, is that something that needs to be prioritized? Does it need to be scanned? Is there a reason why it hasn't been digitized or accessed by people? And then one of the most important things is copyright. So you have to look at, are things copyrighted? Does the photographer still own the copyright? And they might not or do not want you to make their collections accessible to all. This falls more into like books than photos, but you still have that. And so, one thing to remember is if you do look at a collection, to get permission from the owner if it's not owned by your organization.
All right, another challenge is cost, of course. There is the digitization hardware and software that Andretta walked us through in her section, and then also thinking about the collections management system or DAMS system that you're getting. There's the one-time setup, the configuration, the migration, and then license to use it, license to store it, any sort of customization you need. Andretta, I realized I just said your bullet point. Would you like to add to it?
So one thing is to look at storage cost as well. How much does that cost and for how long? Some storage is relatively inexpensive, while other storage versus in-house versus out-of-house, cloud versus physical. There's a lot of things to look out for costs for storage specifically. Digitization hardware, the equipment, and the software. There's software that is as good or better that's free or cheap than the paid versions. And so definitely look at all of your options regarding hardware and software before making a decision.
Thinking about the CMS and the dams cost a little bit further, there's then the annual costs and just a quick snapshot for you to think about. And there is another webinar for this as well. There's the free to low cost options, which you can get some great utility depending on your own skills and knowledge and comfort in working with those tools. Many of them can be $0 to like $3,000-ish dollars. Lower cost products like off the shelf from a vendor, it can be about 5,000 to 7,500. If you start getting into the moderate costs, it's because you're typically a larger organization, more collections. Maybe it's like two organizations and you need a collaborative portal. That starts getting into the $10,000 to $20,000 a year range. And then if you are a large, multi-institutional, terabytes of things, thousands of records, tens of thousands of records, it's then you start looking at, maybe it's the same product, but it's a much more bigger, robust product to contain your collection. And those can get up to about 50,000. So if you don't already have a CMS or DAMs in place, it is important to think about the costs as you start heading that direction.